Jack Miller's boots clanged against the rusted metal floors of the old factory, the echoes bouncing off the towering walls of the cavernous space. The air was thick with the scent of oil and decay, a testament to the years of neglect that had allowed the building to fall into disrepair. As he walked through the empty halls, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Just nerves, he muttered to himself, shaking off the unease that had settled in his stomach. He had taken the job of foreman to escape the suffocating monotony of office work, yearning for something hands-on and gritty. This factory, with its history and potential, seemed like the perfect challenge. The place had been closed down for over 20 years, left to rot after a tragic accident that had claimed the lives of several workers. The previous foreman had vanished soon after the incident, leaving behind a legacy of whispered rumors and unanswered questions. But Jack wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He was here to breathe new life into the factory, to turn it back into a bustling center of productivity. As he made his way to his office, a small room perched on the second floor overlooking the main production area, Jack couldn't help but notice the layers of dust and grime that coated every surface. The windows were smeared with dirt, allowing only the faintest traces of daylight to seep through. He pushed open the door to his office and was greeted by a gust of stale air. "Well, it's not much, but it's a start," he said, flicking on the lights. The bulb flickered uncertainly before casting a dim glow over the room. A battered desk sat in the center, piled high with old papers and tools. Jack set down his bag and took a deep breath, ready to dive into the task of organizing and cleaning. Hours passed as he sifted through the remnants of the factory's past. There were blueprints for machines long since dismantled, ledgers detailing orders and shipments, and photographs of the workers who had once toiled within these walls. One photo in particular caught his eye. It was a group shot, the faces of the men and women smiling proudly despite the soot and grime that covered them. Jack's gaze lingered on the figure in the center, the previous foreman, a stern-looking man with piercing eyes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the factory floor, Jack decided to call it a day. He locked up the office and made his way back to the main entrance, the sound of his footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. Just as he reached the door, a whispering breeze rustled through the factory, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound. The murmur of voices. Jack paused, straining to hear. The voices were soft, like the distant hum of a conversation just out of reach. He shook his head, dismissing it as the wind playing tricks on his mind. But as he stepped outside and locked the door behind him, he couldn't ignore the chill that had settled over his skin. Driving home, Jack tried to focus on the tasks ahead. He had plans to bring in a crew to start repairs, to clear out the debris and restore the factory to its former glory. But the strange sensations and the eerie whispers lingered in his thoughts, casting a shadow over his excitement. That night, as Jack lay in bed, he dreamed of the factory. In his dream, the halls were alive with the sounds of machinery and the chatter of workers. He saw the faces from the photograph, their smiles replaced by expressions of pain and fear, and at the center of it all was the foreman, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. Jack awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself it was just a dream, a manifestation of the stress and excitement of starting a new job. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him in the shadows of the old factory, something that wasn't ready to be forgotten. Jack's first week as the factory foreman passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and coordination with contractors. The old building creaked and groaned as workers moved through its corridors, tearing down the rot and decay to make way for new life. Despite the activity, the factory felt oppressively silent when Jack walked through its halls alone. It was on one such evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, that Jack first heard the whispers. He was conducting his usual end-of-day inspection, ensuring that all tools were put away and the machinery was properly secured. The factory was still far from operational, but Jack believed in establishing good habits early. As he walked past the skeletal remains of a conveyor belt, he heard it. A faint, almost inaudible murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Jack paused, his breath catching in his throat. He listened intently, but the sound faded as quickly as it had appeared. Shaking his head, he continued his rounds, chalking it up to the building's old pipes or perhaps his own tired mind playing tricks on him. But as the days went on, the whispers became more frequent. They seemed to follow him, echoing through the factory's labyrinthine corridors, always just out of reach. Sometimes he could almost make out words, fragmented sentences spoken in hushed tones, like a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. One evening, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Jack decided to stay late. He waited until the last of the workers had left, the clang of the closing gate reverberating through the empty space. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured into the bowels of the factory, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The whispers were there, growing louder as he moved deeper into the building. They seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air with a sense of unease. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the sound, each step echoing ominously in the silence. He found himself in the heart of the factory, where the old machines stood like silent sentinels, their rusted hulks casting long shadows in the dim light. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening, a cacophony of voices that swirled around him. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice sounding small and fragile in the vast space. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. For a moment, Jack thought he was alone, but then he saw it, a shadowy figure standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight. It was a man, his form indistinct and wavering, like a reflection in a pool of water. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his voice trembling. The figure did not move, its eyes, if it had any, fixed on Jack with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Before Jack could react, the figure vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. The whispers returned, more urgent now, their tone shifting from hushed conversation to frantic pleas. Jack stumbled back, his mind racing. He fled the factory, the whispers following him all the way to the door. As he locked up and hurried to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the shadows themselves were alive and aware of his presence. That night, as he lay in bed, the whispers haunted his dreams. He saw the shadowy figure again, standing in the center of the factory floor, surrounded by the spectral forms of the workers who had perished in the accident. Their eyes were filled with sorrow and anger, their mouths moving in silent screams. Jack awoke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. He knew now that the factory was more than just a building with a tragic past. It was a place of restless spirits, haunted by the memories of those who had died within its walls. And he was at the center of it, drawn into a mystery that defied explanation and threatened to consume him. Determined to find answers, Jack resolved to uncover the truth behind the whispers and the shadowy figure. But as he delved deeper into the factory's dark history, he couldn't help but wonder if he was in over his head, if the forces that haunted the factory were beyond his understanding, and if he was destined to share the same fate as those who had come before him. The next morning, Jack arrived at the factory with renewed determination. He couldn't ignore the whispers or the shadowy figure he had encountered. He needed to understand what had happened all those years ago and why the spirits seemed to be reaching out to him. His first stop was the local library, a small, dusty building on the outskirts of town. The librarian, an elderly woman with silver hair and a kind smile, greeted him warmly as he approached the desk. "Good morning," Jack said. "I'm looking for information on the old factory on Elm Street, specifically about a tragic accident that occurred there." The librarian's smile faltered, and a shadow of unease crossed her face. "The old factory, you say? That place has quite the dark history. Follow me." She led him to a back room filled with archives, yellowed newspapers, brittle documents, and faded photographs. Jack settled into a chair as the librarian brought him a stack of newspapers from the year the accident had occurred. As he sifted through the articles, the story began to unfold. The factory had been a booming business in its heyday, employing hundreds of workers. But one fateful night, a catastrophic accident had claimed the lives of 21 employees. A boiler explosion had triggered a chain reaction, causing a fire that swept through the building with terrifying speed. The reports were harrowing, describing the chaos and panic as workers tried to escape the inferno. The bodies recovered from the ruins were charred beyond recognition. The investigation that followed pointed to negligence and unsafe working conditions, and the foreman at the time was held responsible. However, before he could face trial, he disappeared without a trace. One article caught Jack's eye. It featured a photograph of the foreman, the same stern-looking man from the picture he had found in his office. His name was Thomas Miller, Jack's great-uncle. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he realized the connection. The whispers, the shadows, they weren't just haunting the factory. They were haunting him. Jack continued to dig, uncovering more details about his great-uncle. Thomas had been known for his strict management style and his unwavering commitment to the factory's success, sometimes at the expense of safety. The workers had feared and resented him, blaming him for the hazardous conditions that led to the tragedy. As he read, Jack felt a growing sense of dread. The spirits of the dead workers were seeking justice, and they saw him as the embodiment of his great-uncle's sins. He needed to find a way to make amends, to lay their restless souls to rest. Returning to the factory that evening, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching him. He walked through the dimly lit halls, the whispers rising once more to a fever pitch. The shadowy figure appeared again, standing in the center of the production floor. "Thomas Miller," the figure intoned, its voice a chilling echo. "You cannot escape your past." "I'm not Thomas," Jack replied, his voice shaking. "I'm his nephew. I want to help you. Please, tell me what I can do." The figure seemed to consider this, its form flickering like a candle flame. "You must uncover the truth," it said finally. "The truth of our deaths. Only then can we find peace." With that, the figure vanished, leaving Jack alone in the oppressive silence. He knew what he had to do. He needed to find out what really happened on the night of the accident and why his great-uncle had disappeared. The key to ending the haunting lay in the truth, buried deep within the factory's dark history. Determined to uncover the secrets that had been hidden for so long, Jack set out to find anyone who might remember that fateful night. He would speak to former workers, search through more archives, and do whatever it took to bring the truth to light. The spirits deserved justice, and he was their only hope. The following day, Jack felt a heavy sense of urgency as he walked through the factory gates. The connection to his great-uncle, Thomas Miller, weighed on him. Determined to uncover the truth, he knew he had to face whatever haunted the factory head-on. As dusk fell, Jack found himself once again alone in the vast, silent factory. He had decided to stay late, hoping that confronting the spirits might reveal more about their demands. The whispers began almost immediately, a low murmur that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. He made his way to the heart of the factory, the same place where he had seen the shadowy figure the night before. The machinery stood silent and still, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Jack stood in the center of the room, his heart pounding. "I'm here," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Show yourselves. Tell me what you want." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the temperature dropped sharply, and Jack could see his breath misting in the air. A figure began to materialize in front of him, slowly taking shape until Jack could make out the features of a man, the same spectral figure he had seen before. This time, the figure was more defined. He wore the tattered remnants of a factory uniform, his face streaked with soot and blood, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow locked onto Jack's. "Thomas Miller," the spirit intoned, its voice a haunting whisper. "You must right the wrongs of the past." "I'm not Thomas," Jack insisted, taking a step forward. "I'm Jack, his nephew. I want to help you. Please tell me what happened." The spirit seemed to waver, as if struggling to maintain its form. "The accident was no accident," it said, its voice filled with pain. "We were sacrificed for profit. Unsafe conditions, ignored warnings. We were doomed from the start." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The workers hadn't just died in a tragic accident. They had been victims of negligence and greed. His great-uncle's actions had cost them their lives, and now they were trapped, their souls unable to find peace. "What can I do?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. "How can I make this right?" The spirit's form flickered, and more figures began to appear around him, the spectral shapes of men and women, their faces twisted in anguish. They surrounded Jack, their whispers blending into a cacophony of sorrow and anger. "Find the truth," the spirit said, its eyes boring into Jack's. "Reveal what happened. Make those responsible pay. Only then can we rest." Before Jack could respond, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The whispers died away, leaving him alone once more in the silent factory. Jack stood there for a long moment, trying to process what he had learned. He knew now that his task was not just to uncover the truth, but to seek justice for the souls trapped within the factory. He had to find the evidence of negligence, to expose the truth of what had happened all those years ago. Only then could he hope to free the spirits from their torment. With renewed determination, Jack set to work. He spent the next few days poring over old records, interviewing former workers, and digging through archives. Each piece of information he uncovered painted a clearer picture of the events leading up to the accident. He discovered that Thomas Miller had indeed ignored multiple safety warnings, prioritizing production over the well-being of his workers. There were memos detailing faulty equipment, reports of dangerous working conditions, and even letters from concerned employees, all of which had been dismissed or buried. As Jack delved deeper, he found a name that kept appearing in the documents: Henry Lawson, the factory's owner at the time. Lawson had been a ruthless businessman, known for cutting corners and maximizing profits at any cost. It became clear that he had played a significant role in the tragedy, his negligence and greed leading directly to the fatal accident. Armed with this knowledge, Jack knew what he had to do. He needed to confront Henry Lawson and hold him accountable for his actions. The spirits deserved justice, and Jack was determined to deliver it. The factory had been a place of death and sorrow for too long. It was time to bring the truth to light and finally lay the ghost to rest. Jack's investigation into the factory's tragic past had only deepened his resolve to seek justice for the restless spirits. However, as he continued his work, the factory seemed to grow more hostile. The whispers were no longer just whispers. The entire building seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and Jack often felt unseen eyes watching his every move. One evening, Jack found himself working late yet again, sifting through more dusty records in his office. The air was heavy and oppressive, the silence broken only by the distant hum of machinery. Except the factory's machinery was supposed to be off. Jack froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, the unmistakable clanking and whirring of old machines coming to life. His heart pounded as he grabbed his flashlight and made his way to the production floor. The sight that greeted him was both surreal and terrifying. The dormant machines were moving on their own, gears turning and belts spinning as if driven by some unseen force. Jack's flashlight beam flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" In response, the machinery clanged even louder, the cacophony of metal and steam filling the air. Jack approached the nearest machine, a large press that should have been silent and still. As he reached out to touch it, a ghostly hand emerged from the gears, reaching towards him. Jack stumbled back, his flashlight falling to the floor. The spectral hand was followed by another, then another, until a whole apparition emerged. A worker, his face twisted in agony, his body mangled by the machine that had killed him. "Help us," the ghostly worker whispered, his voice echoing in Jack's mind. "We are trapped, forever reliving our deaths." Jack's mind raced. The machinery wasn't just coming to life, it was reenacting the moments before the fatal accident, the spirits trapped in a never-ending cycle of pain and death. He had to do something, but what? How could he free them from this torment? Before he could think further, more spirits appeared, their forms emerging from the machinery around him. Each one was a vision of horror, their bodies bearing the marks of the gruesome injuries that had claimed their lives. They surrounded Jack, their eyes pleading for release. "You must stop the machines," one of them said, a woman with a gaping wound in her side. "Break the cycle." Jack nodded, his fear giving way to determination. He rushed to the control panel, his hands shaking as he tried to shut down the power. But the machinery seemed to have a life of its own, the controls unresponsive. Desperate, Jack grabbed a nearby crowbar and began smashing at the machinery, trying to force it to stop. Sparks flew, and the noise was deafening, but he didn't care. He had to end this nightmare. Finally, with a last mighty swing, he managed to disable the main power switch. The machinery ground to a halt, the spirits' anguished cries fading into silence. Jack stood there, panting and covered in sweat, the crowbar slipping from his grasp. The ghosts gathered around him, their forms flickering like dying embers. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice soft. "But this is not enough. You must reveal the truth. Only then can we be free." With that, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air. Jack felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, but he knew his task was far from complete. The machinery might be silent for now, but the factory's dark history still hung over it like a shroud. Jack spent the next few days trying to track down Henry Lawson. The former owner was now an old man, living in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of town. It took some persistence, but Jack finally managed to secure a meeting. As he drove up to the grand mansion, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. This was the man responsible for so much suffering, and Jack was determined to make him face the consequences of his actions. Lawson greeted him with a cold, calculating gaze. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice as sharp as ever despite his age. Jack didn't mince words. He laid out the evidence he had found, detailing the unsafe conditions, the ignored warnings, and the tragic accident that had resulted. He spoke of the spirits trapped in the factory, their souls unable to find peace. Lawson listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Jack finished, the old man let out a bitter laugh. "You think you can scare me with ghost stories?" he sneered. Those workers were expendable. Their deaths were unfortunate, but necessary for progress. Jack felt a surge of anger. "They were human beings," he snapped, "and their spirits are still suffering because of you. You need to take responsibility." Lawson's eyes hardened. "Get out of my house," he said coldly, "before I call the police." Jack left, his heart heavy with frustration. Lawson's refusal to acknowledge his guilt only strengthened Jack's resolve. He knew now that he had to bring the truth to light, to expose Lawson's crimes to the world. Back at the factory, the spirits awaited him. Jack stood in the center of the production floor, the silence pressing in around him. "I won't give up," he vowed. "I will find a way to make this right." As he spoke, the air seemed to lighten, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. The spirits might still be trapped, but they had an ally in Jack, and he would do everything in his power to free them no matter the cost. The next few days were a blur of frustration and determination for Jack. He was more convinced than ever that Henry Lawson's greed and negligence had caused the deaths of those workers, and the only way to free their spirits was to expose the truth. Jack immersed himself in research, reaching out to anyone who might remember the factory and its dark history. One evening, after another long day of dead ends and unanswered phone calls, Jack decided to revisit the factory. As he entered, the familiar chill settled over him, and the whispers began almost immediately, a constant murmur that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. "Show me the way," Jack whispered into the darkness, hoping the spirits would guide him. "Help me find the proof I need." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging him deeper into the factory. Jack followed the voices, his flashlight casting long shadows as he navigated the labyrinthine corridors. The air was thick with the scent of oil and decay, the oppressive atmosphere pressing in on him. He found himself in the old records room, a space he had only briefly glanced through before. Dusty shelves lined the walls, crammed with ledgers, blueprints, and documents. Jack began to sift through the piles, searching for anything that might provide the evidence he needed. As he worked, the whispers seemed to coalesce into distinct voices, fragments of conversations from the past. He heard the anxious murmurings of workers, the stern commands of his great-uncle, and the ever-present hum of the machinery. One voice stood out from the rest, a woman's voice, filled with fear and desperation. "We warned them," she said, her tone trembling. "We told them the boiler was faulty, but they did nothing." Jack's heart raced as he followed the sound, digging through the records with renewed urgency. He uncovered safety reports, memos, and letters, all pointing to the same conclusion. The factory's management had ignored repeated warnings about the faulty boiler. Among the documents, Jack found a worn leather-bound journal, It belonged to Thomas Miller, his great-uncle. Jack hesitated for a moment, then opened it, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. The entries painted a chilling picture of a man obsessed with profit and efficiency, willing to cut corners and take risks to keep the factory running at full capacity. In one entry, dated just a week before the accident, Thomas had written about the growing concerns among the workers. He had dismissed their fears, confident that the faulty boiler could be patched up without expensive repairs. Jack's hands shook as he read the final entry, penned the day of the explosion. It was brief, just a few terse sentences. Boiler acting up again, need to push through. No time for repairs. The journal was the smoking gun Jack had been searching for. He knew it was the key to exposing the truth and holding Henry Lawson accountable. But as he turned to leave, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing his flashlight. The whispers grew louder, filling the darkness with an overwhelming sense of urgency. "You must make them hear," the woman's voice said, now clear and distinct. "They must know what happened to us." Jack stumbled out of the records room, clutching the journal to his chest. He knew he had to act quickly. The spirits were counting on him, their voices a constant reminder of the injustice they had suffered. As he exited the factory, he could almost feel their presence, urging him on. The next morning, Jack contacted a local journalist, Sarah Peterson, who had a reputation for uncovering corruption and wrongdoing. He arranged a meeting at a nearby cafe, bringing the journal and the documents he had found. Sarah listened intently as Jack laid out his findings, her eyes widening as she read through the journal entries. "This is damning evidence," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "If we can corroborate these claims, we can blow this story wide open." Together, they began to piece together the story, reaching out to former workers, local historians, and anyone who might have information about the factory and the accident. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Henry Lawson and Thomas Miller had been directly responsible for the tragedy. As the story took shape, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just seeking justice for the spirits. He was fighting for the truth, for the memory of the workers who had died so needlessly. The night before the story was set to go to press, Jack returned to the factory one last time. The whispers were there, but now they seemed calmer, almost hopeful. He stood in the center of the production floor, holding the journal. "I've done what you asked," he said softly. "The truth will be known." For a moment the factory was silent. Then, one by one, the spirits began to appear, their forms flickering in the dim light. They surrounded Jack, their expressions no longer filled with anguish, but with gratitude. "Thank you," the woman's voice said, and Jack felt a warm, comforting presence wash over him. The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and closure. Jack left the factory, knowing that the spirits were finally at rest. The next day, the story broke, and the town was rocked by the revelations. Henry Lawson was brought to justice, his reputation shattered, and the memory of the workers honored. Jack stood at the factory gates, looking at the building that had once been a place of death and sorrow. It was still a place of history, but now it was also a place of truth and redemption, and for the first time Jack felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had fulfilled his promise to the spirits and laid their voices from the grave to rest. The news of the factory's dark past and Henry Lawson's culpability spread quickly, shaking the town to its core. Lawson was arrested, facing charges of criminal negligence, and the workers' families finally began to receive the acknowledgement and compensation they had long been denied. Jack felt a profound sense of relief, knowing that he had played a crucial role in bringing justice to the victims. However, the factory itself remained a place of eerie quiet. Despite the peace Jack had brought to the spirits, the oppressive atmosphere lingered, as if the building still held onto remnants of its tragic history. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that his task wasn't entirely complete. One night, unable to sleep, Jack found himself drawn back to the factory. He walked through the gates, the familiar chill settling over him. The machinery was silent, the whispers gone, but the silence felt heavy, pregnant with unresolved tension. He wandered through the corridors, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. As he approached the old office where he had found his great-uncle's journal, Jack felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. His breath fogged the air, and he stopped in his tracks, senses on high alert. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a spectral form more defined than any he had seen before. It was Thomas Miller, his great-uncle, his face a mask of torment and regret. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he faced the ghostly apparition. "Thomas," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I know what you did. I know you were responsible for the deaths of those workers, but justice has been served. Henry Lawson has been exposed." The spirit of Thomas Miller hovered silently, his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to reach across the years. Jack felt a wave of sympathy for the man who had been driven by ambition and greed, only to be haunted by his own conscience. "I wanted to make things right," Jack continued. "I wanted to give those workers peace, but it seems like you are still trapped here, tormented by your own actions." The ghost's expression shifted, a flicker of acknowledgement passing over his features. Jack took a step closer, his voice softening. "Tell me how I can help you find peace," he said. "What can I do to free you from this torment?" Thomas's ghost reached out a hand, pointing towards the old office. Jack followed the gesture, his mind racing. He entered the office, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. As he searched the room, he noticed a loose floorboard near the desk. Kneeling down, he pried it open, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside, he found a stack of letters yellowed with age. He carefully unfolded the first one, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. The letters were from Thomas, addressed to his family. They were confessions, written in the days following the accident, detailing his guilt and remorse. Thomas had planned to send them, but he had disappeared before he could. Jack read through the letters, his heart heavy with the weight of his great-uncle's anguish. Thomas had been consumed by guilt, haunted by the lives lost under his watch. He had wanted to confess, to seek forgiveness, but fear and shame had driven him to disappear instead. As Jack finished reading the last letter, Thomas's ghost appeared beside him. The spectral form seemed less tormented now, as if the act of revealing his hidden guilt had lifted a burden from his soul. "I'll make sure these letters are delivered," Jack promised. "Your family deserves to know the truth. And maybe, by doing this, you can finally find peace." Thomas's ghost nodded, a look of profound gratitude in his eyes. Slowly, his form began to fade, the torment that had clung to him dissipating like mist in the morning sun. Jack left the factory, the letters clutched in his hand. He knew what he had to do. The next day, he contacted his relatives, arranging a meeting to share the letters and the story of Thomas's guilt and remorse. It was a difficult conversation, filled with tears and pain, but it brought a sense of closure to his family. Back at the factory, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. The machinery stood silent, the whispers gone, and the spirits at rest. Jack knew that the factory's tragic history would never be forgotten, but it had finally been acknowledged and laid to rest. As he stood at the gates one last time, Jack felt a profound sense of accomplishment. He had not only brought justice to the victims, but had also freed his great-uncle from his torment. The factory, once a place of death and sorrow, had become a symbol of truth and redemption. Jack turned away, ready to move forward with his life, knowing that he had done everything he could to honor the memories of those who had suffered. The factory's ghosts were at peace, and so was he. Despite Jack's efforts, the uneasy feeling that lingered around the factory refused to completely dissipate. Although the spirits of the workers seemed at peace, something darker remained. Jack couldn't ignore the sensation that another presence, perhaps more malevolent, still haunted the factory. One evening, determined to confront whatever remained, Jack returned to the factory armed with a plan. He had researched ancient rituals and methods to communicate with restless spirits. If there was any lingering entity, Jack intended to bring it into the light and confront it directly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the factory floor, Jack prepared for the seance. He arranged candles in a circle in the center of the production area, their flickering flames casting eerie light on the rusted machinery. The air grew colder, and the whispers began anew, but this time they felt different, more sinister. Jack took a deep breath and began the ritual, reciting the incantations he had carefully memorized. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. The candles flickered, their flames dancing wildly. Jack focused, calling out to the lingering presence. "Show yourself," he commanded, his voice steady. "I know you're here. Reveal yourself and tell me what you want." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a dark shadow began to form in the center of the circle, coalescing into a figure that exuded malice. It was the spirit of Henry Lawson, his face twisted with anger and bitterness. Jack's blood ran cold as he faced the specter of the man who had caused so much suffering. "Why have you come back?" Jack demanded, his voice trembling. "You've been exposed for your crimes. The workers have found peace. What do you want?" Lawson's ghost glared at him, his eyes burning with hatred. "Peace?" he snarled. "I will never find peace. I am bound to this place, tormented by the lives I took. And now, you will suffer as I have suffered." The air grew colder still, and the factory seemed to shudder under the weight of Lawson's wrath. Jack stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I won't let you hurt anyone else," he said firmly. "Your reign of terror ends here." Lawson's specter let out a chilling laugh. "You think you can stop me? I am beyond your reach, boy. My sins are too great, my soul too stained. You will never rid this place of me." Jack knew he had to act quickly. He reached into his bag and pulled out the letters he had found, the confessions written by his great-uncle, Thomas Miller. Holding them up, he faced Lawson's ghost. "These letters tell the truth," Jack said, his voice strong. "Thomas admitted his guilt. He was haunted by what he did, just like you are. But he sought forgiveness. And now, I offer you the same chance. Admit your wrongs, seek redemption, and maybe you can find peace." Lawson's ghost hesitated, his form flickering. For a moment it seemed as though he might relent, but then his expression hardened once more. "Forgiveness?" he spat. "I do not seek forgiveness. I seek vengeance. You are a fool to think you can change anything." With a roar, Lawson's ghost lunged at Jack. the temperature plummeting as the spirit's malevolence surged. Jack staggered back, the force of the attack nearly overwhelming him, but he held his ground, clutching the letters tightly. "Then I will do it without you," Jack shouted. "I will ensure the truth is known, and your legacy will be one of shame and disgrace. You will be forgotten, erased from history, while the memory of those you wronged will live on." The spirit recoiled, its form wavering as if weakened by Jack's words. The whispers grew louder, and Jack realized they were no longer just voices of the past. They were voices of defiance, of the workers who had suffered under Lawson's rule, now standing with him. With one final desperate effort, Jack hurled the letters into the air. They burst into flames, their light blazing brightly in the darkness. The factory seemed to tremble, and Lawson's ghost let out a furious scream, his form disintegrating in the intense light. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the air growing warmer as the malevolent presence faded. The whispers ceased, replaced by a profound silence. Jack fell to his knees, exhausted but triumphant. The factory was finally free from its darkest haunt. As Jack stood and made his way to the exit, he felt a sense of closure. The spirits of the workers were at peace, and even Henry Lawson, in his twisted way, had faced some measure of justice. Jack knew that the factory's history would never be forgotten, but it could now move forward, unburdened by the weight of its tragic past. He walked out into the night, ready to leave the factory behind for good. The confrontation had been harrowing, but Jack had emerged victorious. The factory was no longer a place of death and sorrow. It was a place of redemption and truth, and Jack had played his part in its transformation. In the days following the confrontation with Henry Lawson's ghost, the factory seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but he knew there was still one final piece of the puzzle to uncover. His great-uncle Thomas had sought forgiveness, but Jack felt there was something more hidden within the factory's walls, a final revelation that would complete the story and bring true closure. Jack returned to the factory one last time. The air was clear, the oppressive atmosphere gone, but the sense of unfinished business lingered. He walked through the silent halls, determined to uncover whatever secrets remained. He found himself drawn back to his great-uncle's old office. The room was as he had left it, the loose floorboard still exposed. Jack knelt down, searching the hidden compartment once more. This time, he noticed something he had missed before: a small metal box tucked into a corner. With trembling hands, Jack opened the box. Inside, he found a collection of photographs, letters, and a worn diary. As he flipped through the contents, the final pieces of the story began to fall into place. The photographs showed Thomas Miller with his family, his face stern but proud. Among them were pictures of the workers, their smiles wide despite the grime and soot that covered them. The letters were addressed to Thomas's wife and children, filled with love and regret, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating man Jack had read about in the journal. The diary was the most revealing. In it, Thomas had poured out his soul, detailing his descent into guilt and madness after the accident. He wrote about the pressures from Henry Lawson, the corners he had been forced to cut, and the nightmares that plagued him every night. But one entry stood out from the rest, dated just days before Thomas's disappearance. It spoke of a hidden ledger, a record of bribes and payoffs that Lawson had used to cover up the factory's unsafe conditions. Thomas had hidden the ledger in the factory, hoping it would one day be found and used to bring Lawson to justice. Jack knew what he had to do. Armed with the diary, he began his search for the hidden ledger. The factory, now free of its ghosts, seemed to guide him, as if the spirits of the workers were leading him to the truth. After hours of searching, Jack found the ledger hidden behind a false panel in the wall of the old records room. The book was filled with damning evidence, transactions, signatures, and notes detailing Lawson's corrupt practices. It was the final piece of evidence needed to cement Lawson's guilt and bring full justice to the workers. Jack contacted Sarah Peterson, the journalist who had helped him before. Together, they presented the ledger to the authorities and the press. The revelations sparked outrage and calls for reform, ensuring that such a tragedy would never happen again. As the town reacted to the news, Jack felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The factory's story had finally been told in full, and the spirits of the workers could truly rest. Henry Lawson's legacy was destroyed, and the memory of those who had died was honored and preserved. With his task complete, Jack visited the factory one last time. The building, once a place of death and sorrow, now stood as a monument to truth and redemption. Jack walked through the halls, feeling the presence of the spirits, not as whispers or shadows, but as a comforting presence, a part of the factory's fabric. As he stood in the center of the production floor, Jack spoke aloud, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Thank you," he said, "for guiding me, for helping me find the truth. Rest in peace." The air seemed to shimmer, a final acknowledgement from the spirits. Jack smiled, feeling a sense of closure. He turned and left the factory, the sun setting behind him, casting the building in a warm golden light. The factory's dark past had been uncovered, its ghosts laid to rest. Jack walked away, ready to move forward with his life, knowing that he had done everything he could to honor the memories of those who had suffered. The factory was no longer a place of haunting and sorrow, but a place of truth, justice, and redemption. And Jack could finally find peace, just as the spirits had.